David, thank you very much for spending time with us again today.
Thanks for having me back.
Let's begin. Tell us what was the motivation in writing your new book, David Suzuki, an Autobiography?
Well, when you get to be 70, you know that you've lived the bulk of your life, and now the end is in sight, and the road to that end is getting steeper and steeper. I thought it was a good moment to kind of sit back and take a bit of reflection on that life, maybe drawing a few lessons here and there. But mainly, I wanted to talk about the last 20 years of my life. And, these days in the media, environmentalists are portrayed as kind of these depressing people walking around with a little cloud over their head and, doom and gloom. Everything's going to hell in a handbasket. And we're constantly, pointing our finger and saying, bad, 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 you got to do it. I mean, that's the way the media portray us. And in my experience, that's not what environmentalism is at all. I've gone to some amazing places on the planet, had wonderful adventures with some of the greatest people I've ever met, and now and then we get to celebrate victories. So it's been a really exciting, uplifting part of my life. So I kind of wrote the book hoping young people especially would read it and say, gee, I'd like to do that. That sounds like fun, working for a better future. So I hope to inspire people.
Talk a bit about how your early childhood affects your views now. You were, and your family were put in an internment camp very early in your life.
Yeah. When Pearl Harbor happened, of course, there was a tremendous panic in North America. And here were all these Japanese living along the coast. In Canada, there were about 22,000 Japanese. Most of them were citizens by virtue of being naturalized Canadians, but about 15% of them were like my mother and father and my sisters and me. We were born and raised in Canada. As soon as Pearl Harbor happened, of course, then there were suddenly all these Japs on the West Coast, and people were afraid. They looked different, they behaved different, and so all of our rights of citizenship were suspended, and our property was confiscated, and we were shipped off to camps for the duration of the war. And at the end of the war, in Canada, unlike the United States, the government didn't want any Japanese left in the province, so they gave us a choice. You can sign up and give up your citizenship and get a one-way ticket to Japan, or get out of the province and go east of the Rockies. People were so pissed off at the government that over 95% of them signed up and said, we're getting out of here, we're leaving this country. Of course, when the first boats went back, the letters started coming back, don't come, it's flat, it's terrible. My mother's mother and dad, my grandparents, went over on the first boat, and they ended up being dumped in Hiroshima, and both of them were dead in less than 9 months. So my parents said, look, we've never been to Japan. This is the only country we know, so we ended up in southern Ontario, in the middle of the country. And for me, that experience, being considered less than worthy of being considered a Canadian, shaped the way I am. I mean, it left me with a lifelong need to do things to prove to Canadians that they made a mistake, that we are worthwhile people. And it's one thing when you're a young person trying to work as hard as you can to prove your worth, but when you're 70, it's kind of a sickness, that my wife is constantly saying, David, why did you agree to do that? And I have no explanation except that I felt I had to, and I've got to learn to say, look, you've spent your life proving it, now get on with it, stop trying to do that. So it really has been a compulsion that I've had as a result of those years. I was watching one of my old television programs a few nights ago with my wife, and suddenly she said, David, do you realize every time your face appears on camera, you turn away? And I hadn't even realized that automatically I just don't like looking at myself. Why? Because all through the war, we were taught you're the enemy. I was the classic caricature of a Jap, the slitty eyes, and I was the guy that was the enemy. And to this day, I hate the way I look. I don't like. So those are just the consequences of the war years. Of course, I learned to live with that. But what I do think is, think about African Americans or Native Americans who've been taught generation after generation, you're nothing, you've got nothing to teach us. You know, natives were taught you're savages and the best thing you could do is become like us. And so that gives me a very profound empathy for what minority groups in this country have gone through because of what I went through in a much smaller way.
And when did your interest in genetics and biology begin? Well,
it was a natural thing, I guess. I was very fortunate. My dad was, I used to call him a mutant. You know, as a child of immigrant parents, the lesson they were pounded home was go out and make money. Like immigrants are always trying to get security and they have a tremendous drive. That's why immigrants are so much energy when they come to a country is they see opportunity. And he was taught, you're the eldest in the family. You've got to be a model for your brothers and sister. You've got to work hard and make money. He never did. So he was always considered a failure by his mom and dad, my grandparents. He believed you have to work hard to make money for what you need, the necessities. But he always taught me, don't run after money. And people that bragged about how rich they were, how big car they had or their clothing, he said, you feel sorry for them. They've got off on the wrong path. And he loved nature. He just loved camping and fishing and hiking. So my first memories of childhood are going camping with my dad. And that's been the real important part of my life, was that just being out of doors and fishing and camping. And so it was only natural when I was a good student in school, and they taught us that education is the important thing. We're very poor after the war. Education is your key to get out of this poverty. And so you study hard. So I naturally went into biology. Now, at first I wanted to study fish. I wanted to be an ichthyologist. And everybody said, hell, you'll never make a living at that. Then I got really keen. My mom made me a little butterfly net, and I got really keen on collecting insects. So I thought maybe I'll be an entomologist. But then once I got to college, if you were smart and you were interested in biology, naturally you wanted to go into medicine. So I applied to medical school, and I was accepted at the University of Western Ontario, where I lived in London. And but my last year in college, I was an honor student in biology. I had to take genetics. And I just fell madly in love with genetics. And it was such a precise, elegant science that I turned down the offer that I had to go to medical school. My mother wept for months. She couldn't figure out how I could turn down a chance to be a medical doctor and instead go on for a PhD studying fruit flies. But that's what I did. I went on to the University of Chicago studying genetics of fruit flies. And it was, when I came back to Canada, I was all set to go into becoming a famous geneticist. And in the very year that I started as a professor at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, a woman named Rachel Carson published a book called Silent Spring. And it was all about the unexpected effects of pesticides. Now, I was a geneticist, but as I read the book, it was as if she had written the message to me as a scientist. And the message was, you scientists are clever. Yeah, you can invent things like DDT and study it in the lab and show that it kills insects and doesn't harm plants. But you make a mistake in thinking what you learn in the lab is equally applicable in the real world. Because what you're studying in the lab is an artifact. It's an artificial situation. It doesn't tell you anything like what you're going to study in the real world, because out there, you spray it out in open fields, and you end up affecting fish and birds and human beings. Because in the real world, everything's connected to everything else. And for me, that was a huge lesson, because I always thought, well, when I do my studies of genes in the lab, then I can predict what's going to happen out in the real world. And she was saying, you can't. And so I was drawn out of the lab into environmental issues. I still had a scientific career, but I also got swept up in environmental issues. And now my great regret is that my colleagues, my peers in genetics, they haven't got the message that Rachel Carson gave. So all these geneticists and biotechnologists, they think you manipulate genes in an organism in the lab and you study them in growth chambers, and then they can say, oh yeah, it's safe. You can go out and release these organisms into an open field, or start growing genetically engineered trees, or release genetically engineered salmon into the ocean. They forgot the lesson Rachel Carson taught us. You can't predict what's going to happen out in the real world. So I've spent a lot of time in my last years warning that yes, genetics is very powerful and biotechnology is powerful, but be very, very careful, because we don't know what we're doing.
And then how did you get involved with producing media?
Well, that was, a fluke. When I left to go away to Amherst College in the States in 1954, there was no television station in London, Ontario. Now, London at that time had about 100,000 people. It was a small town. But television was just coming into London. The only people that had TV sets in 1954 had a giant antenna, and they would capture the signals from Cleveland or Detroit. There were no stations in London. So I never watched television. I went away to college. I was too busy studying to look at television. The first time I had a TV set was when I went away to become a professor in Alberta in 1962. So television, I didn't watch any television. But Edmonton, the university had a program back in 1962 on a local cable community channel called Your University Speaks, and it was unbelievably boring. But someone heard that I was a good teacher, so they asked me to do a show, and I did one. They loved it. So they said, do another, and then another. And I ended up doing 8 programs. So what surprised me is I started coming to campus after a couple of those shows, and people would stop me and say, hey, I saw your show last week. I thought it was great. And I'm going, what the hell are you doing watching this crummy little show? And that's when I realized, holy cow, people watch a lot of television. It wasn't what I did, but it gave me the idea television is a very powerful way to educate people. So it planted a seed in my head that this is an important medium you've got to pay attention to. I moved then to the University of British Columbia, and over the years people would say, hey, would you come and do a book review on science? Or there was a new discovery made, would you come on air and do a commentary? So I began to get involved in ways here and there. And finally I said, gee, maybe I should do a show showing Canadians that science is important and giving them the information they need to understand science. And it ultimately led to a career then. I did a show called Suzuki on Science, and it was all about different discoveries being made in various areas. I did a show called Interface Science and Society, talking about the moral and ethical implications of science. And then I did a program, Science Magazine, and then got caught up with the nature of things. So I was still doing science in the lab, but I had this second career that led me further and further into the media. And I'm very proud to say that in Canada since 1960, there has been a program called The Nature of Things. In prime time, having to get a good, big audience to compete with the American networks since 1960. In the United States in that period, there has never been a serious science show on any of the major American television networks. And I can see the effect of that lack of a serious science show. You've had Nova on PBS. That's a very tiny elite audience. In terms of the public, when I come to the States, I'm always amazed that there's still a huge debate about intelligent design and creationism. That's not an issue in Canada. I come down here and there are all these kind of religious issues over stem cells and cloning and all kinds of discussion about is global warming going on or not. Over 80% of Canadians are saying global warming's happening, we got to do something. And yet when I come to the States, I was just on a radio program this morning, people are saying, we don't believe what you're saying about global warming. That's a lot of baloney. So the level of discussion is very different in the United States and Canada. And I believe in part it's because we've always had a serious science program in prime time on television. You've never had one in the United States.
Do you see that also coming from the fact that Canadian television tends to be funded independently, whereas U.S.'s corporate control.
That's right. I mean, we've had CBC, which is a public network funded like the BBC. So that and the CBC, I must say, has always been very, very adventurous and experimental, always taking flack from the private sector. I mean, ever since I got involved, I started hosting The Nature of Things in 1979. And ever since I've been involved, we've been attacked by the forest industry, by the chemical industry, the fossil fuel industry, the pharmaceutical industry, because we're always raising issues they don't like to have discussed. I don't see that in the private networks because they depend on ads.
How much influence did you have on the content of your shows?
Well, I've had as much as I wanted to. So there are a lot of shows we do that I'm not very interested in, and they run. We do them and they run on air. But there are a lot of them where I'm vitally interested in, genetic engineering. We did shows on cloning and shows on greenhouse gas, global warming. Lots of shows on the pharmaceutical industry. I've been very, very interested. Forest industry. We've done a lot of shows on these issues.
So you kept doing your research and you also kept teaching as well?
I did, but in the 1980s, when genetic engineering was just booming, I could see there were a lot of enormous social and economic implications to what was going on. And I said, if I'm a geneticist using a lot of the genetic engineering techniques, then I would be no different than the scientist working and being paid for by the tobacco industry, talking about the fact that smoking is safe. If I'm doing genetic engineering myself, I would have a vested interest in saying, look, this is safe, don't worry about it, we're taking care of it. And I felt that the issues were so important, there had to be geneticists, trained as geneticists, but who didn't have a vested interest in that activity. So I began to write a series of columns in which I said, I'm going to back away. I'm trained as a geneticist. I know what's going on, but I am no longer going to take any research grants in genetic engineering. I'm no longer going to have genetic engineering techniques used in my lab. I'm no longer going to publish papers about genetic engineering with my name on it. The problem was I had a lot of students and postdocs working in my lab who were saying, listen, we've got to use these techniques. They're very powerful. We're not going into genetic engineering companies or anything, but we need the techniques to explore these questions. And so ultimately I left the lab. I passed the lab on to one of the top students I had who became a professor, said, here, take it on. And I stepped out of research. That was a huge decision for me because everything in my training was you have to keep going as a scientist. Your whole identity and your pride was having a grant and doing research. And stepping back from that was a huge decision on my part, a very difficult one. But I did in order to maintain my credibility in speaking out about these issues.
Do you have any regrets from that?
Oh, there are times when I regret I missed the lab. That was one of the most exciting periods of my life. The lab was my whole life. I was living, going to the lab 7 days a week. I'd very seldom leave the lab before 1 or 2 in the morning. My wife finally said, look, you've got to make a decision. You've got a family, you've got a wife. You're going to have to spend more time with us or the marriage is over. And I gave up the marriage for the lab, and that was a very painful time for me. But I was very ambitious, and it was very exciting. We were doing work I feel was as good as anybody else in the world. It was a big kick. It was a hoot. Giving that up was very, very, very hard. And going into the lab and you're surrounded by people who are all as excited as you, and they're talking, and it's a great joy. Mind you, I'm a lot older now. Often, if I did a big experiment, I would sleep at the lab. I had a little cot, and I'd count fruit flies till I couldn't see straight, and lie down and sleep, and get up and count fruit flies. And I couldn't do that now. I'm not as ambitious, and I'm a lot older. But the joy of having a group is something I'll always miss.
Do you think genetic engineering as an industry now is even more influenced by corporate money?
Absolutely. And I think this is the part that really distresses me, is that there is an enormous power now, because these companies are based on investors that want to make their money by getting a product out. So there's huge pressure then on the scientists to get an application out. And the thing that I keep saying is, I don't doubt there are going to be very important discoveries made that will be absolutely critical in the future. The problem now is the rush to exploit these ideas. And people say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, when I graduated with a PhD in 1961, I tell kids today what our hottest ideas were in 1961. And of course, they fall down on the floor laughing. 40 years later, the hot ideas of 1961 seem ridiculous because they're so far off the mark. But then I say, listen, another 20 years from now, the hot ideas of 2006 are going to appear every bit as ridiculous. Don't you understand? The way that science works is that you are always proving your current ideas are wrong. You know, you go into a revolutionary area, you don't know anything. You make a series of observations, and then what you do is you set up a hypothesis to try to explain what the heck you've seen. And then you do an experiment. The value of a hypothesis is it allows you to make a critical test. You do an experiment, you get the data, you look at it, and you go, oh my God, was I ever off the mark? And then you set up another hypothesis. That's how science works. That's the best of science, is constantly proving your current ideas are wrong. And in any revolutionary area, most of your current ideas are going to prove to be wrong. We had a big hero in Canada over 20 years ago, a man named Terry Fox, who lost his leg through cancer. And he decided he was going to run across Canada and raise money for cancer research. And when he started on the East Coast, nobody even knew what he was doing. But he ran with one leg. He ran and ran for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And by the time he got to the center of Canada, everybody was just following him like a big hero. And he got to the center of Canada, and the cancer came back. And it was one of the most heartbreaking things to see him taken off the road, weeping and saying, you know, the cancer's come back and it's in my lungs, but I hope they'll cure me and I'll come back and finish the trip. Well, he got taken to British Columbia. They gave him the hottest drug at that time, a genetically engineered drug called interferon 3. And we all thought this is going to be it. He died not months or even weeks later. He died days later. Now, I'm not going to say that treatment was what killed him, but I can tell you today, interferon 3 is not used for anything like the cancer he had then. But we constantly rush ourselves into believing our ideas are really hot and they're the right ones. And I think that it's a very, very dangerous thing, especially when our ignorance is so great. Yes, we've got very powerful tools for flipping genes back and forth and making products, but we don't have a clue what the implications of those manipulations will be in the long run. And the corporate drive to make profit now is hurrying us far too rapidly.
Do you think science as a whole could benefit from an injection of the democratic process in where resources are spent?
In terms
of direction, general direction?
Well, I think the problem we've got today is there is already too much direction being dictated. Right now, there's a huge thrust by the funding agencies that say we want a cure for cancer, we want to solve this problem of global warming, and so money goes where there are current hot issues, and scientists go where the money is. Now, the problem is science doesn't move that way. Science doesn't go from experiment A to experiment B to experiment C to a cure for cancer. Now, but because the government is saying, here's money, we'll give you this money if you can show us that you're working towards a cure for cancer. So all of us scientists play this game. We say, I'm interested in the rectal temperature of penguins. I'm making this up, of course. And there's suddenly money for global warming. So if I study the rectal temperature of penguins and show that it varies by blah, 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 then ultimately I can do this experiment, and I'm going to find a way to control global warming. And that's the way that we get scientific funding. But that isn't the way science works. It's a myth. Science, when you do experiment A, you have no idea what the results are going to be. If you knew what the results are going to be, you wouldn't do the experiment. So you do the experiment, the next thing you know, oh my God, I'm off doing experiments way over here in a different direction. That's the way science works. You go off and your experiments lead you along because you get answers you didn't expect. And then, you're doing your studies and you happen to go to a meeting, or you're in a bar and you meet another scientist working in a totally different area, and you start talking about what you're doing and he tells you what he's doing, and suddenly you go, hey, with my results and what you're getting, I bet you we could do, and suddenly you're doing an experiment together and you're finding something that could lead to some important application. That's the way that science is done and is applied. We perpetuate a totally artificial notion that science proceeds in a linear fashion from A to B to C to D to a cure for cancer. And I think that's a very dangerous way. And what we should be doing is supporting people in science because they're bright. They're really smart and they ask good questions, period. And if they're really good and you support good people in all kinds of areas, believe me, applications are going to come out. We can't predict what they'll be. But if you've got a lot of people doing a lot of good experiments, eventually there will be cures and solutions to this and that coming out of it. But I think it's a mistake to say, give the money only to those guys that are doing experiments on cancer research. I think back on a woman named Barbara McClintock, and way back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, she was doing studies in corn. And her experiments were absolutely exquisite. And I remember as a graduate student having to read her papers. They were really hard papers, but they were so elegant, we were made to read them. What she was studying was genes in corn that jumped from one place on the chromosome to another. They were jumping genes, and when they jumped from one place to another, they affected the behavior of the genes where they jumped to. I mean, this is bizarre. And she elegantly showed how you can control where those genes jump from cell to cell. And we always said, those are so wild, they're only found in corn. I mean, it's weird. We had to study them because they were elegant genetics. Nobody ever dreamt in the 50s and 60s when I was a student that her work would lead to the discovery of a whole series of jumping genes in fruit flies and human cells and other kind of cells, and that it would become a very powerful tool for the study of genes and development, and that she would win a Nobel Prize. But that's what happened. If way back in the 30s and 40s, she was told, you've got to do research that will be applied in the area of development, she would never have got a grant for what she was doing. And I can tell you, experiment after experiment, scientist after scientist, who was studying all kinds of weird things. I remember a guy named Werner Arber, who was studying how bacteria could keep bacterial viruses from infecting them. Now, you got to admit, that's a pretty obscure thing. The bacteria have their own viral diseases, and this guy was studying how bacteria are resistant to viral infection. Well, guess what? What he discovered was that those bacteria were able to resist viral infections because they made a protein that chewed up the viral DNA. They were called restriction enzymes. They restricted the virus from infecting the bacteria. Well, guess what? Those restriction enzymes recognize very specific DNA sequences and are now one of the critical tools that has made genetic engineering possible. Nobody ever imagined that Werner Arber, studying how bacteria resist virus infections, would lead to one of the important tools of biotechnology, and that he would win a Nobel Prize. So I'm sorry I've given you a very long answer, but I really think that you support top-notch scientist, on the faith they're going to find something interesting. We have no idea where, but they're going to find something interesting and useful.
So you gave up your work in the lab. Did you keep your teaching?
No, I got the university. They wanted to keep me on the roster because they felt it added luster to their faculty. But I said, look, it's important for me to remain a faculty member, that I've got a home here. And I will teach occasional guest lectures in different courses. But I'm doing too much television and traveling to be able to teach a full course in a semester. So they gave me a position. They called me a full-time professor at 1/3 pay. And I would give maybe 6 or 7 lectures in the university during the year. I had my home base, but I was able to do my television too. But I retired. They made us retire when we reached 65, and I was happy to become an emeritus professor after that.
So did you then kind of do your teaching through your television?
Then television became, my vehicle for reaching a very, very large audience. Television, radio, and I wrote columns and books as well. So I feel that I've still been trying to take the same message, trying to educate people about science and why it's important to take it seriously. And I feel in many ways the scientific community is failing miserably when you think that over 20 years ago, the leading scientists in the United States were saying global warming is real, human beings are a major part of it, and we've got to act now. And look at what you've got. You've got a two-term president who has continued to deny the reality of climate change and is rejecting the Kyoto Protocol to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that is a direct slap in the face of the scientific community. The National Academy of Sciences of the United States, the leading institution of the top scientists in the world, has been saying for over 20 years, we've got to do something, and the government doesn't do anything. That is an insult. And I think that's a failure, a reflection of the fundamental failure of this country to take science seriously.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think we're...
Well, I think that education hasn't paid enough attention. In Canada, I sat for 4 years on a committee to look at science education in Canada. And our recommendation was that science should be every bit as important as reading, writing, and arithmetic, that every student from kindergarten to grade 12 should have 1 hour of science every day of their education. So that's a huge shift. We believe that you can't have an educated society and it's absolute if you're not dealing with science. And how can they possibly deal with issues like the social and ethical and political and economic ramifications of cloning? Look at the level of stem cell discussion. You're still arguing about whether evolution is real. I mean, Europe and Canada have left that issue a long time ago. How are you going to deal with machines that can think? What about nanotechnology? What about biotechnology? What about research in outer space? What about deforestation or toxic pollution in the atmosphere? How can you deal with these important issues if you're not scientifically literate? You can't just say, oh, well, this is based on economics. You've got to look at the scientific basis and take it seriously. And I believe that the United States and in a way Canada too, although we've had the nature of things in Canada, the issues are dealt with in too superficial a way. And we're not taking science seriously.
Do you think part of that is due to a purposeful dumbing down of U.S. citizens?
Well, in terms of an issue like climate change, and certainly in forestry, the corporate sector has in many ways used environmentalists, used scientists, and essentially monkey-wrenched the issue. I know for a fact that the forest industry, when we were having very great success in the 80s in stopping clear-cut logging and getting areas set aside as parks, forest industry then began to set up groups called SHARE, share the forests and began to say, the environmentalists are greedy. They care more about spotted owls than they do about loggers. And they very successfully countered a lot of the things that environmentalists were raising. And certainly on the issue of climate change, the fossil fuel industry, the auto industry, the corporate sector has created websites that seem to be green, that talk about, the global environment. But they've really supported a handful of climatologists and scientists who are saying no. And they've acted, and the media then gets sucked into it. We want to do a show on climate change. Well, we got someone here who says global warming's happening, we got to do something. But, we have to have a balanced program. And it would be too biased to say everybody says this is happening. So you put on one of a handful of skeptics who are saying, no, it's not happening. And then to the public, it looks as if the scientists haven't figured it out yet. Well, half of them say it's happening, half of them say it's not. But the reality is 99% of the scientists are saying it's happening, for God's sake, let's get going on it. And this tiny handful of 10 or 12 naysayers, most of them supported by the fossil fuel industry, are saying no. And the public has been confused about what the issues are.
Again, you're looking at, here in the U.S., I'm not sure what it is in Canada, but where the corporations that control the major television networks, radio networks,
Absolutely.
Newspapers, are in bed with the very corporations that are, the polluters that are producing these products.
The Fox network, I think, is absolutely scandalous. The kind of positions they're taking, which are really corporate positions, and the way that they attack, for example, climatologists saying global warming's happening. It's absolutely scandalous. This is not objective reporting in any way. But they clearly want science to be there to support a corporate agenda, or else it's what they call junk science.
And even currently here in the U.S., the labeling of environmentalists that do physical damage to different facilities being painted as eco-terrorists.
Mm-hmm. Well, I regret that there are people who feel so desperate that they're going to, put sugar in the gas tanks of trucks or caterpillars, and that is happening, or who drive spikes into trees. I regret that very much. I don't think that we have to have that kind of civil disobedience. But, I also decry the fact that these people are called eco-terrorists. You want to know what eco-terrorists are? Eco-terrorists are people that say baloney to global warming. We're going to continue to pump out all kinds of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's eco-terrorism. Eco-terrorism to me is people that come in and say, we're going to clear cut this forest and we don't give a damn about what that's going to do to the quality of the air, the water, or other creatures. That's eco-terrorism. Let's put it in perspective. There is, as far as I know, there has not been a single person killed by people who are monkey wrenching trucks and putting spikes in trees. But I can tell you, people have been killed by the corporate sector. Just go to Nigeria and see what Shell is doing with armies of people that are killing people in Nigeria, the Ogoni people. You can go to when Greenpeace, when a vessel was sunk in New Zealand, a guy was killed. He was drowned in that vessel. All kinds of people are being injured and manhandled by the corporate sector. That's eco-terrorism.
Getting back to your personal story, when and why did you create the David Suzuki Foundation?
Well, we came out of the Amazon after we'd been down there in 1989, living with the native people there. And as we came out of the forest and saw the burning going on and the destruction from gold mining, we realized, Tara and I, my wife and I, had been supporting Native people around the world, and people would come and ask us for help, and we'd try to help them here and there. But it was all done in kind of a helter-skelter way, whether Tara and I had the money and the resources to help people. And we realized that this is a huge issue, and we need a bigger thing than just her and me. We needed an organization. And so we called together a group of environmental activists and said, this is in 1989, is there a need for yet another organization? And if there is, what would it do that's different from Greenpeace or Sierra Club or NRDC or Environmental Defense? I mean, there were all kinds of environmental organizations. What would we do that's different? And this group, we spent 4 days on a retreat, and they said, yes, there's a need for another organization, but it's got to go to the underlying root causes of our destructiveness. When you're dealing with a polluting factory or a new dam that's going to be built here or a clear-cut logging, it's already too late in a way. What's driving this destructive activity? What is the root cause? So out of that, we came with the decision that we need an organization, but it should be deeply rooted in science. We have to take the best scientific information that we have and then analyze the root causes of our destructiveness so that we can find alternatives, that there are solutions out there. We can get on to what we call a truly sustainable path. And then we should use our money as best we can to communicate those ideas out to the public. So we call ourselves a science-based organization. We say solutions are in our nature. We've got to find solutions based on the best science. And then we've got to make the public aware of what alternative ways of doing things are. We're a small organization. We've only been around for 15 years. But we are now we're trying to position ourselves so that when governments or corporations are going to start a new program or a new idea, before they do, they say, before we do that, why don't we float it by the Suzuki Foundation, see what they think and get their input. That's what I'm trying to get ourselves positioned as. We will have the credibility to be seen as something that the corporations or governments would come to for advice. And it's happening in Canada.
And you've been taking that effort worldwide as well.
Well, we're trying to communicate our ideas. We've got a program now called Sustainability Within a Generation. And the idea is let's stop fighting the corporate battles or the political battles, which are very short-sighted. Let's look ahead one generation to the year 2030, and let's say, what kind of a Canada would we like? How about a Canada where the air is clean and 15% of our kids don't develop asthma? How about a Canada where you can drink the water out of any river or lake and you don't have epidemic levels of breast cancer in women? How about a Canada where you could catch a fish and eat it without worrying about what's in it? When you phrase it that way, everybody agrees. I've taken it to the business community in Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto. I've taken it to the multi-faith community in Toronto. Took it to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities of Mayors of Cities in Canada. Everybody says, yes, I like that vision of Canada. It would be great if we could achieve that by 2030. So suddenly you've got two things. You've got everybody on the same page. Everybody's agreeing with, and we've got a target. We know where we want to go. So now, before we get into a fight over this new dam you want to build, we got to say, wait a minute now. Remember, this is what we're trying to go to. So let's ask, will this dam get us closer or further away from that target? Then the question is, can we achieve it? Well, we've divided our activities up into 9 areas: food, water, forests, energy, agriculture. And then we say, in these 9 areas, can we achieve sustainability by 2030? And we believe we can in every area. We call this project Sustainability Within a Generation. And what it says is we've got to have concrete targets and timelines. At year 1, this is what you got to do. Year 2, you got to be there. Year 3, year 5, year 10. You have to set targets and reach those. And we believe if you do that, we can have sustainability within a generation. Huge support for this idea in Canada. And we're saying to people, look, take this sustainability within a generation, take it off our website, use it at the provincial level, provincial governments, federal governments, municipalities, in your neighborhood. Start saying, how do we make this a living document and a goal? I took it to Harvard University, and we met with over 30 environmentalists, scientists, funders. They said there's no document like this in the States. They hired 2 researchers, and they've made an American document with American figures. And now they're taking it to the 30 largest environmental organizations in the United States. There's an umbrella organizations, Green something, which is the 30 biggest environmental groups. This is now tens of millions of Americans support these groups. If we can get this group to adopt sustainability within a generation as their overarching vision and strategy, and all agree to work within that, then I believe you've got something very, very powerful. The Australian Conservation Foundation has taken our document and is making an Australian version. So by focusing in Canada and developing a plan and then spreading that to other countries, I like to think that we're having an effect around the world as well. So this is a very, very exciting project, sustainability within a generation, and we've got to get on with it.
And do you see that as the viable path now, as compared to going through governments themselves directly?
I think that it is an option. Governments have got to play a role in this. In order to achieve that kind of sustainability, we can't have government just pulling back. Corporations, governments have all got to be a part of it, and they've got to see where they fit in these targets that we're setting. So whether it's reduction of greenhouse gases by this much by the year 2007, 2008, 2009, businesses, corporations have to be involved in achieving those targets. Governments need to do what governments are best set out to do. They've got to start passing laws. They've got to set targets. They've got to start using the most powerful tool they have at their power, which is taxation. They've got to start using taxation to tax the things that we don't want. I'm sorry, corporations, we need a green tax. We need a carbon tax. We have to start making, if you don't like carbon taxes, the words, then let's say polluter pays. Those people that are putting out a lot of carbon dioxide, you're going to have to pay for that. Those of you that are reducing your carbon dioxide output, we're going to give you tax breaks. For those things that we want salaries. Let's pull back on taxes. So people making a salary don't have to pay that kind of tax. Let's put those taxes on big SUVs. And let's take the taxes off and give a reward to people that are driving Priuses or Honda Civics or the gas electric hybrids. Let's give them a break. Let's use taxation in a way to encourage the things that we want to have happen and discourage the things that we don't want.
And you mentioned exporting your plan to both the U.S. and Australia, and those are both happen to be countries that are not signing on to the Kyoto
Well, I think
Accord.
you're going to see a great shift happening in the next few years. The election in the United States just this past month has had a huge impact. We'll have to see what it's going to settle down and actually result in. But I think that the overwhelming majority of Americans are beginning to realize that global warming is happening and we've got to do something. They want something done. I mean, when you have a Republican governor in California taking very, very serious steps to reduce greenhouse gases and saying, we've got to ignore the Bush administration. We've got to get on with it. When you have 300 mayors of cities in the United States that are saying, look, we're going to ignore what our president is doing. We're going to meet the Kyoto target. You know something is happening. And now that you've got Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, I think you're going to see some shifts happening. And certainly when Mr. Bush is out of office, I believe there is going to be a sea change in this country. You have to be. It's urgent.
In addition to the bigger plan coming out of the Suzuki Foundation that you've been talking about, you also have the Nature Challenge, which individuals can undertake.
This is because so many people say to me, look, okay, Suzuki, I hear what you're saying, but what difference does it make whether I do anything? What can I do to make a difference? People don't want to do something trivial where they know it's not going to have an impact, but they feel helpless because, they say, well, I'm one out of 6.6 billion people. What difference does it make whether I do this or that? So that's why my foundation teamed up with the Union of Concerned Scientists in the States and said, okay, where do individuals impact on the environment, on nature? And it turns out right away the three areas are what you eat, how you move, and where you live. So food, transportation, and housing, each of us has an impact. And looking at those three areas, we came up with a list of the 10 most effective things that we can do. And I'll be honest with you, when they brought me the list of 10 things the first time, I threw it on the floor. I said, come on, this is too easy. You telling me giving up your car 1 day a week is going to have an effect? Giving up meat 1 day a week is going to be effective? And then they showed me the scientific reasoning behind each of the steps. And now I'm convinced those are 10 effective things. Now, if one person in North America does those things, it's nothing. It's insignificant. But if hundreds of thousands of insignificant people are doing some of these things, believe me, it is effective. We've got 300,000 Canadians signed up to do it now. I want to get 1 million Canadians. We call this a nature challenge. If you go to our website, davidsuzuki.org, you can click onto the nature challenge. There's a nature challenge for kids, nature challenge for schools, nature challenge for business. We're trying to get as many people as possible all signing up and agreeing to do a few of these things in the coming year. And it will be effective. And there'll be a spin-off. If we can get 1 million Canadians signed up, I'm absolutely convinced I could take this nature challenge to any politician and say, 1 million Canadians have signed up to take the challenge. Will you? And every one of them will. And that's how we're going to bring about change at the political level.
So you have just completed your autobiography, and I know many people are heartbroken to hear that it sounds like after writing over 40 books, you're thinking of hanging it up at this point.
Well, I've made up my mind. I'm not thinking about it. I know that's it for me. I mean, I've written 43 books. I've been able to do that because I've had a lot of co-authors that have done a lot of the work with me. But now writing a book is a lot of work, and I want to have time to do a few other things before I kick the bucket. And I'm in the last years of my life, and I've left off doing things because I said, I'm too busy. And I want to do those things. I want to study Spanish. I want to learn about geology. I want to do some wood carving and some water painting. I think in a way I've done enough. Now I can take a little time to do those things. And I want to spend a lot more time with my grandchildren.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time. What final thoughts would you like to leave with our listeners?
Well, I hope if they look at the book and read it, they will not, it's not about, isn't David Suzuki great? But wow, one person can make a contribution. I know I have no illusions that I am so important I'm going to turn things around. I have no illusions that my foundation is going to make that huge difference. But I believe if millions and millions of individual people like me, if thousands and thousands of organizations like mine are all doing their small part, we can become an irresistible force. And so I hope I can inspire a few people with a few things that I've done in my life that they'll get involved.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thanks a lot for having me.
We have just been talking with acclaimed geneticist and environmentalist David Suzuki, author of the new book, David Suzuki, The Autobiography.